we'll let Andrew introduce himself and discuss.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. My name is Andrew Parks. I've been designing board games for the past 20 years. I have over 30 board games published, mostly with Z-Man Games and with WizKids. And this project I've been working on, Tales of the Arthurian Knights, for 16 years, off and on. It is the most difficult project I've ever worked on, and hopefully will ever work on. It has a long and storied history that we don't have the full amount of time to discuss, but I'm going to just talk today about kind of the challenges that I had in trying to take the subject matter of the Arthurian romance, which they were written over the course of hundreds of years, and try to adapt it for a modern audience. So I'll give you a little bit of background on the project, and I'll give you a little bit of background on how it started and some of the, I guess, controversies that we sort of had to really focus on avoiding, or at least being able to address and approach. So we will begin from there. So the origin of the project is that there's a game called Tales of the Arabian Nights by Eric Goldberg. How many people are familiar with this game? It's this fun storytelling game, right? It's very different. It first came out in 1985. It's a storytelling paragraph game. It started the genre. It took sort of like a choose your own adventure book and put it into a game. It used charts and things different from a choose your own adventure book, but it opened up these pathways to all these crazy stories and adventures and things that could happen to you. And typically really horrible things happen to the players. And that's part of the fun of the game. This is actually the original cover from 1985. Then there were other editions. I think there was a German edition that came out in the 90s. And then in 2009, Z-Man Games did an extremely popular edition of the game. They brought it like back into the popular consciousness of modern gaming, and people just ate it up. They loved it. It was a much more deluxe edition of the game. And also at that time, which not a lot of people knew, I'm giving a little bit of the inside track here. I hope nobody's recording this, just kidding. Z-Man Games obtained permission from the designer, Eric Goldberg, to pursue making other games that used the same general mechanisms with various different genres. And one of the first ones they thought would be perfect would be something to do with the Arthurian Knights. So I wanted it to be Tales of the Round Table, but several people on Board Game Geek had said, no, if it's Tales of the Arabian Nights, this new game has to be Tales of the Arthurian Knights. You know, because that's just too cool. And I really resisted this, but Zev was like, the people have spoken. If you know Zev, this is how he talks. The people have spoken, Andrew. We are going with Tales of the Arthurian Knights. So that is the way that we move forward. Now, this is back in 2009, actually in 2008, before the new edition came out. We were already talking about this Arthurian Knights game. So let's move forward from here, and let's talk about some of the issues that I was unaware of when I first started working on the game. These issues weren't really as much of a big deal in 1985, but in 2009, and as the years started to move forward, there started to be more and more of an online reaction to issues that occur in this game. And so let's talk about some of these. The first was that the romance in the game, very specifically, could only take place between people of opposite genders. There's actually an entire section of the rulebook that talks about this and why obviously you can only have a romance option if the person is the opposite gender. And so they take great pains to specify this, even in the Z-Man version that came out in 2009. And so at first, people, I kind of just got through that. And then as the years went by and the game continued to be popular, people started talking about this more and more as an issue with this game and not really in keeping with a modern audience. The other big thing, even bigger, is that there are status cards that you can receive in the game. And one of those cards was a sex change card, apparently because in one of the Arabian Nights tales, someone has a magic spell cast on them that changes their gender. There's actually even a magic item in Dungeons and Dragons that reflects the same thing. I think it was called the Girdle of Masculinity, Femininity. But what made this card so controversial wasn't that it changed the gender of the character, but the card specifically said, you cannot win the game while you have this card. In other words, it was the ultimate curse, was to have this happen to you. So over time, these reactions grew more and more. And as we were working on the very beginnings of Tales of the Arthurian Knights, my own developers talked to me about this and how are we going to address this with Tales of the Arthurian Knights. So before we get into how we started to address this, I wanted to talk a little bit about myself and my own Arthurian background and how Zev asked me to do this, because Zev and I actually published Z-Man Games' first board game. They had only done card games before this. The first board game was called Ideology, the War of Ideas. So that was 21 years ago. And then I had also worked on this game. I was the designer for Camelot Legends, which was a card game. So this was my second game ever that I had designed that was published. And Zev knew that I had done this game for him, but also knew that I had an extensive background besides that. One of the reasons I worked on Camelot Legends is that I had spent my life studying King Arthur. In undergraduate at Rutgers and in graduate school at Drew University, I had focused on the Arthurian romances. That was one of my two periods, Renaissance and medieval. And for my medieval period, I focused specifically on Arthurian romance. So I really wasn't looking as much at modern stuff. To me, Malory was the end point. I was really beginning before that, really with Chrétien de Troyes and Geoffrey of Monmouth. This was, to me, the heart of the Arthurian romance. And one of the things that I felt was that the movies that had been coming out, including the great movie Excalibur, one of my favorite movies of all time, really focused on the main story towards the end of Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur. It was about Arthur and Guinevere and Lancelot and the big wars. And they really moved away from the essence of the Arthurian romance, which was a single knight going out into the world and meeting bizarre things that sort of tended to reflect their own minds. They would meet magical things and it would teach them something about themselves. And this, to me, was the heart of it. A little bit of that is reflected in the new movie. Well, not that movie. I guess it's 2 years old, The Green Knight. Anyone see The Green Knight? They kind of focused on that kind of feeling of those original romances. And the whole romance genre was created by Chrétien de Troyes. And it was, I think it was Eric and Enid was the first of the romances that he wrote. So I really studied these at great length. And then I got to put those things into practice. For 10 years, I was the chief scriptwriter for the New Jersey Renaissance Kingdom. Did anyone ever go to that back in the 90s in Somerset? We've got one guy right there. Yay. And someone back there. Awesome. So we did a whole Arthurian storyline for several years that changed. I actually played King Arthur. And it actually changed from year to year what the story was. And we took great license. We had King Percival as the king of Camelot at one point, and just we kind of wrote our own stories based on that genre. And we had this cool thing called the Enchanted Forest, where you could go in and there was a story that was like those old romances. So this was my background. I had spent a lot of time studying and implementing both through theater and through game design, and that's why Zev had asked me to work on this. When we did the New Jersey Renaissance Kingdom, we were already talking about bringing some of these things forward that were, we wanted people to feel like they were in that time, but we also wanted to have some elements that were more modern. So, for example, in the Arthurian romances, there are no female knights of any kind. But there were some female knights that took place in other legends. So there was, in addition to the Arthurian romance tradition, there was a romance tradition called the Carolingian romance tradition, where it was Charlemagne, not Arthur, who was the king. And Roland, or Orlando is his other name, was the hero. And they had a female knight character named Dame Bradamante. And later, Edmund Spenser took this same character and called her Britomart in The Fairy Queen. So we created this Dame Britomart character. Here's the actress here, Christina Gray, playing that part. And we also had other female characters fighting with swords. One of the things we wanted to do is say, okay, look, we know our audience wants this. We didn't have any in the first few years, and our performers and audience members said, we want some female knights here. We want to have some of this. And so we did add some of that into the storyline. The other thing we wanted to make sure that we did was stray from something else. And that is that although there are actually quite a few knight characters in the Arthurian romances who were from the southern lands, either from Spain or from Africa, there was always this caveat with these characters in the medieval legends that they had to be baptized. So many of the characters were Muslim characters, and they would not be accepted into the Arthurian romances unless they were baptized first. So we tried to, even in the early days of the Renaissance Festival, we had a character named Palamedes, who was a famous Arthurian knight, and we had a quest for the Holy Grail. And Palamedes, whose character was a Muslim in the story, was the only knight who found the Holy Grail, because he had the humility that the other knights did not have. And that picture is actually of him giving it to his half-brother, who was King Percival, having found the Grail. We had it as a physical object, even though really, if you study the Grail, it's more of a symbolic or a spiritual object. But anyway, so this sort of gives you an idea of my background and the kind of writing that I did, and my desire to keep things as much as possible to feel like the original legends. I didn't want people to feel like this was a modern story, but there were other things also I wanted to bring forward to make it more suitable for a modern audience. So when I started working on this, is actually the cover of the Book of Tales that will come out. It's a 380-page book that's going to be in Tales of the Arthurian Knights. The game is coming out in November. It is a hardcover, faux leather bound. It lays nice and flat. So that's a little preview there for you. And so when I began working on it, I soon began to discover that this was a really big project. Like, this was really beyond my imagination. Like, I started like working on the mechanisms. I know there's things we wanted to change. We really wanted to increase choice and customization in the game. In Arabian Nights, a lot of things happen to you, and you're not really in a lot of control as to what you sort of give a response, but what happens to you isn't necessarily involved with that response. So we wanted to make it more like a choose your own adventure book, where someone reads a paragraph and then you give one of several unique choices. Like, you may either say this to the person or whatever. So it's different for every single encounter. And then you go to a second layer of choices where you use skills. This made it even more of a massive project. So this would end up taking, as I said, the better part of 16 years. I didn't work on it steadily for 16 years. As you'll see, there were a lot of wrenches being thrown at us and at the project over time. So this is kind of how things started. So once again, a year before the second edition of Arabian Nights came out, we started working on this. So one of the things we wanted to do in the game was right away, we wanted to have female knights. We went right away, had Dame Bradamante from Ariosto's Orlando Furioso. We just grabbed her and stole her right from Ariosto and put her into our game. Also, there's a character named Lady Enid from Chrétien de Troyes, really the first medieval romance ever written, Eric and Enid. And she goes on adventures, not as a knight, she goes on adventures with her husband. And we said, okay, let's make her into another female. So these are both playable knights. So this is Dame Bradamante's illustration here for the game. But then we said, but we don't want this to be the only two knights. These are the two playable knights, but we also want people to encounter female knights during the game. So we made this sort of a part of the world. I felt like I still wanted there to be some social resistance to this in the world. So you'll see some characters who say they don't want their daughter to be a squire, that sort of thing. So there's still some resistance, but we kind of splice them into that universe. The other thing, well, first of all, there is no example of a character changing their gender in the Arthurian Knights, so we don't have that status card here. But also, we talked from the very beginning about having same-sex romance arcs. I had just played the Mass Effect games. Ever played Mass Effect? That was a somewhat controversial thing back then when those games came out, that same-sex romance arcs were a regular part of that game, and it was very successful. So originally, when I was talking to Z-Man Games about this, they said only if if you can find examples in the original legends of same-sex romance arcs, would we include them? And understand that things changed very quickly in this country in a great way between 2008 and 2015, when gay marriage became the law of the land. In 2008, the two Democratic presidential candidates both said that marriage should be between a man and a woman. So between that time and 2015, the spirit of this country, and I think throughout the world in many countries, changed. So at this time, it was still going to be something controversial to have. I couldn't really find any, although for anyone who knows Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, there is a little bit of frolicsome play between Gawain and the Green Knight. There is a point where he doesn't know it's the Green Knight. He's just called the host, where the host says, look, you stay here with my wife all day and let her entertain you. I'm going to go out hunting and I'll bring you whatever I find and you give me whatever you find. Well, every single day, his wife would shower Gawain with kisses. So when the Green Knight would return, once again, he didn't know it was the Green Knight, and give him whatever he had hunted, Gawain just grabbed him and gave him some big kisses. So, but that's the closest thing that I could find in the legends. So it was inconclusive. Many of my developers are part of the LGBTQ community. They were really pushing back even from this early time. So this matter was sort of unresolved when the project entered a massive hiatus. What happened, if you know some game history, is that Z-Man Games got sold soon after this time in 2010, 2011. And then a year or two after that, Zev, who had the idea of doing this game, left that company. So at that point, I stopped working on the game. I had mostly been working on the mechanisms, not as much on the writing at that time. So I put it aside and worked on a whole bunch of other things. I eventually started doing games with WizKids, and then Zev Schlesinger was hired by WizKids. And so he resurrected the project and he brought it back. The first thing we said at this point, this is like 2016, 2017, there's no discussion. There will be same-sex romance arcs in this game. We are in a new world than when we talked about this last time. Zev said, absolutely not a problem, no question. They are definitely a part of our game. So what you see here on this side is actually from the rulebook of the new game. And so this was a very carefully written statement on the front page of the rulebook. It was also important to me. I respect that people have disagreements on things. And I also understood that there would be some players who might not feel comfortable having these as part of their game session. And I didn't want to shame those players into playing the game that way. So what we wrote here was, the default rule of Tales of the Arthurian Knights is that anyone can love anyone. For those who wish to include or exclude romantic options in their story, we have an asterisk symbol before any choice or reward that involves romantic love. Players may choose to ignore any text that follows an asterisk that they deem unsuitable for their character. So players can choose to play with this or not, but it was also important to us that the same-sex romance arcs were not a variant, that they were the default way to play the game. And if people didn't want to play with them, that was okay too. So that was the final statement that we crafted, and that is the statement that exists on the first page of the rulebook. And you're the first people seeing it because the rulebook has not been released yet. So we also continued the tradition I started. This is Sir Palamedes, the artwork there. Oh, and that was, by the way, that was Damon Need there. That's her artwork there. As you can see, as you can tell, I really love the artwork. That's why I put it all throughout here. So we did include, there are a lot of characters. Palamedes is the most popular, but there are his brothers, Saphir and Seguirides. There's King Evelok, who helped transport the Grail, was a king in Africa. So we brought all those characters in, and we did not include anything about characters being baptized, and didn't really get strongly into what religion everyone was, because we didn't think that's what the game was about. But we also have no mention of anything about people being baptized or anything like that in order to be accepted into the Tales. The other thing we did was that we have a lot of generic cards in the game. So it was important to us to also include diverse ethnicities among the generic character encounters as well. So there's a card that'll just say king, or it'll just say queen. So we made sure that there were characters that represent all different ethnicities. And that was actually quite appropriate for the Tales, as we said, for the original Tales. So this is some of the beautiful artwork for these characters of diverse ethnicities in the game. The other thing I really had to focus on was how I was going to deal with religion. If you know the Arthurian romances, you know that religion, specifically Christianity, plays a very heavy component in these legends. There are a lot of times where a knight is traveling around and meets a priest, and the priest sits down and just talks about all different scripture and quotes the Bible and tells the player what to do. And I didn't want to lose the heart of that, but I also didn't want to be preachy. This is not a game about Christianity. So what I did was there are references to God, there are references to the Almighty. I didn't make any direct references to Christ in the game. You can see the sort of sensitivity of the topics that I was having to wrestle with. I happen to be Christian, but I also know that there would be people who might feel if I was quoting the Bible and so on, that this game was trying to either convert people or preach to them in some way. On the other side, I also felt that some people who were Christian might feel that, why are you having scripture in this board game? So what I did was I paraphrased some of the stories, but I didn't do direct quotations of scripture. We also have crosses and grails, but we don't really talk about the crucifixion or the Last Supper or things like that. So I tried as best I could to try to have the sort of spirit of some of these Christian ideals without this game being a game about preaching and trying to convert people to a particular religion. So that was the way that I addressed this issue of religion in the game. We also created sort of a mythological backstory, which was a mashup of all kinds of different things. It was a mashup of some of the stories in the Hebrew scriptures, of some of the things from biblical apocrypha, some things from Celtic mythology. I kind of try to find a way to mix it up and make our own backstory. And then this backstory would become our sort of pseudo religion in the game that you would slowly discover during the course of the game. One of the things that I discovered, which I thought was really cool, was this idea, like, how do you have, fairies and angels in the same story? Like, how can you kind of make that work? And in the Middle Ages, there actually was this cool concept that during the war in heaven, for those of you who are unfamiliar, it's sort of a mythology. It's taken from metaphors in the book of Revelation, that there was this war, and this is very much expounded upon in the Middle Ages, that there was this war in heaven between the good angels and the bad angels, and that Lucifer fell from the sky. That's not directly said in the Bible, but it's implied metaphorically in Revelation. But in the Middle Ages, there was also this concept that there was a third set of angels that did not want to get involved in the conflict. They were the neutral angels. They neither fought for or against. They left heaven, not being a part of it. And then folklore from the Middle Ages said that these neutral angels came down to earth and eventually evolved into the Fey creatures. So I was like, oh yes, we're doing that. That is really cool. So that became a part of our story as well, so that you'll meet characters. Some of them are the Celtic deities, some of them could be a leprechaun or whatever, like all these different fairies, and all of them are derived from that war in heaven. And so it helps fit into this sort of mythology that we had created. Throughout all of these different adaptations and making changes to the original legends to adapt it for a modern audience, it was important to me that we still stay true to the spirit of the romances. On Board Game Geek, we actually talked about these different things because people had brought it up. And I didn't know whether WizKids would want me to respond or not, so I did the whole do it now, get in trouble later thing. People brought up the issue of the Arabian Nights, and specifically the issue of gender and other things. And so I just jumped right in and said, listen, this is where we're coming from, and this is what we did. And I actually quoted that thing, even though I didn't show the actual graphic. I didn't get in trouble, fortunately. It had a good response. But some people said, look, all of this sounds great that you're doing these things to adapt to a modern audience. But when I'm playing this game, one of the things I did like about Arabian Nights, this person said, was that I could make crazy decisions that wouldn't necessarily be treated very well in modern times. So don't sanitize, are you sanitizing things? Do I feel like it's a modern morality play? You're just using the Arthurian legends as an allegory for modern things? And I knew that I hadn't done that, so I was able to respond freely saying, No, that's not what we wanted to do. We wanted the game not to judge you. If you want to do horrible, despicable things in this game, you can do so and you can still win. There's actually a villainy track, and you can go up on a divinity track or a villainy track or a romance track. If that's the kind of character you want to build, where you want to have romantic attachments with other characters. Romance was a real part of the stories for me. So you can actually have a beloved that strengthens you by having that beloved. You can have multiple beloveds if that's the way you want to play, no problem. The game's not going to judge you. Other characters might judge you, but the game's not going to judge you. So that was important to me, that even though we made the changes that I discussed, that you could play the character that you wanted to, and the game wasn't going to hurt you for being a bad guy if you wanted to play that sort of a character. So I wrote The Sorrowful Maiden just as a quick example of one of the more, I wanted bizarre things to happen. If you know the romances, really weird things happen. And so The Sorrowful Maiden is an encounter in the game where you're riding along and you hear a woman wailing in the distance beneath a tree, and she's cradling a knight in her arms. And so you ride over to see if you can help her, and you get there and you realize the knight doesn't have a head. And so she says, this knight was slain. I'm going to stay here. I won't leave his side. There's a battle going on to the east. He was slain by King Riance, and the king was slaying people unfairly during a tournament. Go there and avenge him. So I was like, okay, so this is how I'm going to have you be able to choose for this. You can go there and fight and try to avenge this knight that was killed. You can go there and fight for King Riance because you think, okay, why not? He's got the right idea. Or you could you could stay with her and convince her, what, the right thing for us to do is not worry about revenge right now, and let's bury this guy, and help you sort of see the future. Or you could seduce her. So those were your choices for that one. So I wanted players to be able to, and each one leads down a different path of morality for your character. Now I'm not saying you would successfully seduce her, but you could at least make the attempt. So anyway, I wanted to have all these different types of morality in the game, and for the game not to overtly judge you, even though we brought all these other things in. So with all of these controversial topics presented to you of what we worked on in the game, I welcome any questions that you have about decisions we made or things you agree or disagree with what we talked about. Oh, thank you. By the way, this is the Kingdom of Orkney, this illustration here. Yes, sir.
Can you give a brief description of what the gameplay is?
Sure.
Get the feeling of decision making, there's some cards, but
Absolutely. In the Arabian Nights, there's this beautiful board of the world. And so you travel around on point-to-point movement. And when you go to places, you draw cards, and it'll be like a situation or a person, and it will, there's a bunch of, I think, like 16 or 12 different verbs you can use in order to react to that thing. And that will take you to a passage in the Book of Tales, and it will tell you what happened based upon what you decided that you would do. The later edition of the game, in order to create more variety, you would also roll a die. So it would take you actually to one of 3 different passages. So the result ended up being kind of random. There were also weird things, like one of the verbs was drink. So if you saw an ogre, you could say, I'm going to drink the ogre. And sometimes that made sense, and most of the time it didn't. But it was fun because you could try to have all these weird combinations. And a lot of people who played the game said to themselves, we don't really care whether we win or lose. It's just a fun story. And that was basically the way in which the game was played. For hours, I wanted there to be more control over the characters. So therefore, you move on the board, you draw, sometimes you'll draw 2 cards, sometimes you'll take a card and place it on another card. So you get all these strange combinations. There's 400 different combinations of encounters that you can start. And then there are about usually 2 or 3 different initial choices, and then each of those leads to 2 choices. Again, why it took 16 years to write. There are something in the neighborhood, I want to say, of about 1,700 paragraphs that you can encounter during the game. So instead of just having a set of 12 verbs that you can do, you get this initial choice, someone reads a passage, and like a classic choose your own adventure book, it will give you 2 or 3. You can do this, like the one I just described for the Sorrowful Maiden. It'll tell you very specific things based upon that encounter. You'll go to that second page, and then it'll say, which skill do you want to use? And then you roll a die and you add your bonus with that skill in order to succeed with it. Does that help? Cool. Yeah. Yes, sir. What was that?
WizKids is taking orders for Arthurian Knights.
It is, yes. It's doing pre-orders right now. Yeah, and then you get special tokens as well if you do the pre-order. There are these there's a wooden Holy Grail and a wooden Excalibur that you get exclusively with the pre-order. Yes, sir.
In the slide where you said it was important for you to have female presenting knights, you also said that you wanted there to be resistance to that within the world. Can I ask why you wanted that resistance there?
Great question. The reason why is that I felt that and I could go either way. The reason I could either make it so that male and female knights were the norm at that time, or I could make it so that there were female knights who were sort of boldly resisting the norms. And I found that there was something more true to the original romances to have these characters sort of fighting for their place. If you remember, there's a great, of course, I hadn't read it first at this time, but there's the character from Game of Thrones who's the female knight, and how, is it Brianna? I think it is. And what a strong character is, because she's kind of fighting against the convention to be who it is that she is to herself. I didn't want it to be that strong, like there was only one knight in the world. The reason why I felt that I wanted to have the resistance there was that so many of the most famous characters of the Round Table are male. And I had to make the decision whether I was going to change the gender of those characters or not, which I could have done. I decided not to. And therefore, that led me to have most of the Knights of the Round Table be male. So therefore, the feeling that I had was that let's have there be fewer female knights, but have it be something that is revolutionary that's going on in Arthur's time. So not as a sign of weakness of female characters, but just the opposite of sort of, look, and it's kind of, it keeps to the truth of our own times, where women have had to fight very hard against society to get to the place where they are now, and they're still not in a place of equality. So it felt to me to be, I think, truer to the feeling of those legends. But could I have done it the other way? Absolutely. Yep, no problem. Yes, sir.
I know that there's a few different interpretations of the Arthurian, I'm mispronouncing it, but tales. There's the legends themselves as they were presented throughout history. There's the putting it into historical context and understanding the society's time, and then there's the modern interpretation, which has some romance in it. Does the game lead any kind of direction with any of these 3 interpretations?
Great question. Well, one nice thing to know is that the romances themselves over the course of hundreds of years changed absolutely dramatically. Before there were romances, they were sort of folk tales. There was no Sir Lancelot in those folk tales. When the French came and took over the stories, which Chrétien was French, they said, let's have this guy Lancelot. He'll have a special relationship with the queen. So he was actually a later character. And another example of something that was added was Sir Percival was originally the knight who always found the Holy Grail. He was a Welsh character. Later French writers said, we'll still have Percival help find the Grail, but really we need a French guy to do it. So it's going to be Lancelot's son, Galahad. So even in those, there were a lot of changes over the course of time and characters evolved. I tried to draw upon mostly the first 2 that you described. So as far as the history, if there was an Arthur historically, historians say he probably wasn't a king. He was probably a warlord who served a king, who fought against the Saxons and ultimately lost. Bless you. It would be hard for me to try to keep the time period locked into that 600 AD sort of time frame, because as literature was created over the course of the next 1,000 years, all the way up into Malory in 1485 when it was published. It was published posthumously. anachronism wasn't really a thing. So therefore, the knights had the armor of the day in which it was written. So instead of wearing mostly chain and maybe a breastplate, they're wearing the full plate armor out on their horses, similar to the pictures that you saw here. So I gave myself the license to draw upon moments throughout that history, throughout that time. I focused less on modern tellings. I do have maybe one or two oblique references to a particular movie that came out in the 1970s that was not entirely serious about the Holy Grail. You know the movie I'm talking about. I couldn't resist. There is a bridge of death. I'll just tell you that. And people don't build a great wooden rabbit, but maybe another wooden animal that was suggested in the film. So I do have a couple little suggestions for that. I also have one or two references to T.H. White, but for the most part, the stuff that I have is set Mallory and earlier. And because there was so much diverse interpretation of those characters, I also try to draw upon the things that I thought would fit into our own mythology that we have. We're running out of time. Do we have another question from someone? Anything else? 2 minutes. Okay. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Played, in a group we played Arabian Nights many times, generally once every 3 months. It seemed about the right level. So our group never felt that it was all that important whether you win or not. We just wanted to keep playing, and we would keep playing and playing. Sometimes we play for 8 hours. The trouble is the structure of the game doesn't really support that. So
Yeah.
I'm thinking that, you know, if you're coming out with a new version, you should have some sort of long version in the rules.
Yeah, we definitely have different lengths of time that you can play the game. There are a set number of rounds that you can choose from, so the game won't go for 8 hours, I promise. And also we knew that some people would care more about winning than other people, so there is a victory point component in the game, but it's not the most important thing. We actually stress that in the rule book. We also, in addition to having the game have a competitive version where someone wins, we have a solo version and a co-op version. So you can actually play together in order to try to achieve a certain amount within this set of time, and you can work together. There are actually quests that you can do called grand quests, where it actually takes multiple people to complete those quests. So again, adding to that spirit of playing the story how you want to play it. But you can definitely play a longer version of the game. But in general, let's say a 4-player game, if you play the longest version, will probably get to like 3 hours, but there are shorter versions of the game also. Thank you. Any other questions? Thank you, everybody.